Okay, so hello everyone and welcome back to my channel. Today I've got a really exciting video for you all. I feel like I do need to change my intro for these more serious sit-down topics because it seems a little bit like, you know? Anyway, we are going to be discussing the history of mental institutions, mainly in the UK, but it kind of can be universal. But before we get into that, I would really like it if you could subscribe. It would mean a lot to me, and give this video a thumbs up and make sure you comment down below because I love reading your comments, it makes me happy. I love knowing your opinions, your thoughts, all of that. Anyway, let's jump in. In this video, it's not obviously going to be completely talking about every single thing in the history of mental institutions because we would be here all month. However, I've done my best to get the most interesting information and the key points in history of these mental institutions, asylums. We will be using the word asylum or mad asylum. They were called various derogatory things back then. That's not me calling them it. The mental asylum was the historical equivalent of today's modern psychiatric hospital. The word asylum came from the earliest religious institutions which provided asylum in a sense of refuge to the mentally ill. Doctors believed that mental health conditions occurred primarily for two reasons. The person was possessed by an evil spirit or they were just immoral. Both problems could be cured apparently with religious and moral guidance. So that's a little backstory of there, and now we're going to speak about Bethlehem because this is what is known to be the first, it's one of the oldest institutions and it's got the most history on it. So Bethlehem began in 1247, years and years ago. We obviously don't know much from that time period, but we will discuss Bethlehem. Before asylums, people with mental illnesses or learning disabilities were cared for almost entirely by their families. Those who could not be kept at home often ended up in destitute, begging for food and shelter. By the 1700s, there were a few private institutions where wealthy families could send their mad relatives to be cared for with discretion so no one knew. Poor had to rely on local parishes, which sometimes provided charity-funded asylums, and some did end up in workhouses or prisons. More about Bethlehem and the early treatment of patients. For most of its history, Bethlehem was the only dedicated mental institution in Britain, which automatically made its medical staff the foremost experts in the diagnosis and treatment of mental illness because they were the only ones doing it. Medieval thinking held that madness was a disease of the body and not the brain. So discussing a few methods of treatment, it was thought that all mental illness could be cured by inducing reoccurring bouts of vomiting and diarrhea, and by bleeding from the veins. The skin would be blistered with a caustic substance and patients would have their head shaved and be placed in cold baths. This regime would be administered repeatedly and for as long as the strength would bear, and it inevitably led to death sometimes. Another one is rotational therapy. This was developed by the grandfather of Charles Darwin, and it usually involved placing a patient in a chair suspended from a beam by ropes attached to its legs. The chair would be turned 20 to 40 times one way and allowed to spin back to its original position. In 1796, it was recommended that the practice be performed for an hour or two, 3 or 4 times a day for a month. It was deemed an effective way to evacuate the bowels, bladder and stomach and make an impression on the organs of sensibility, the brain and nervous system. It was thought this treatment would induce restful sleep in a patient, much like rocking a baby. The swing chair could also be used as a punishment, a way of asserting dominance over patients who refuse to comply with staff orders. Then we have cold water therapy. Cold bathing was introduced at Bethlehem in the 1680s and became a way of shocking inmates out of their mental illness. It remained a popular course of treatment for much of the 18th century. Patients could be submerged in cold water for long periods of time, wrapped in towels that had been soaked in ice, or sprayed with cold water. By the 1750s, Bethlehem was accepting tens of thousands of paying customers per year, making it a top tourist attraction for Londoners, second only to St Paul's Cathedral at the time in popularity. Most did not wish to admire the manicured gardens or the ornate architecture, but instead they came to visit the hospital's crack-brained patients. For as little as a penny, anyone could gain access to Bethlem's wards in order to stare at, taunt or abuse the people there, the inmates, which is disgusting. An actual, like, can you imagine that today? Diarist Ned Wald visited Bethlem in 1699 and found himself immersed in terrifying world of noise and disorder. He said, quote, "We heard such a rattling of chains, drumming of doors, ranting, hollering, singing and rattling, that I could think nothing but a vision where the damned broke loose and put hell in an uproar." With the patients locked in their cells, he was able to join other visitors into making taunts and jeers through the bars and peepholes. Some inmates were verbally insulted while others were goaded into doing and saying ridiculous things. Those who were beyond conversation at all tried to dissuade people from staring at them by spitting or throwing objects, or just by being silent. More on the early extreme measures these places were put in. Now I'm going to talk a bit more about these even more extreme measures in the early days that mental institutions, well, asylums used. The commonplace use of physical restraints on patients had its roots in the custodial nature of early asylums. The function of mental institutions was simply to keep inmates in custody. The keepers were little more than guards, and it was not uncommon for patients to be kept in chains or other restraints for their time there. The extent to which restraints were used varied from one asylum to another, but they were accepted as a necessary part of mental health care. This one's crazy, but in 1829, going on a little bit, but I just wanted to say this, William Scrivenger, a patient at Lincoln Asylum, was found dead from strangulation after being strapped to his bed in a straitjacket and left overnight without supervision. And here we have, I'm going to show you some pictures, we have a replica of a restraint harness, and this is just awful. We have a straitjacket or straight waistcoat. These honestly are just horrific. Here we have William Norris, confined to his bed by a harness and chains at Bethlem Hospital. This one's a leather belt with manacles. Oh my god, that is horrible. And then we have a replica of a restraint collar. What the hell? And the fact it wasn't found until 1930. By 17,000, Bethlem had a lengthy waiting list, but a persistent need for asylums led to private madhouses springing up all over London. Owning and running a private madhouse required no licence, no qualifications or duty of care, a situation that led to several high-profile scandals as husbands and relatives attempted to lock away inconvenient relatives. So these were not being checked up on. Anyone could make, if they had the money to, they could make their own asylum. In 1762, for example, Mrs. Hawley was kidnapped by her mother and husband and admitted to a Chelsea madhouse. They wished to have her declared insane in order to gain power of attorney over her finances. Once in the madhouse, Mrs. Hawley was assaulted and kept secretly hidden until friends found her and eventually freed her. In the ensuing trial, the madhouse owner admitted that he, in effect, ran a private prison that admitted anyone that was brought there. Concerns over false imprisonment and abuse led to a 1763 inquiry by a select committee of the House of Commons, but a subsequent attempt at legalisation was blocked. It was not until 1774 that the first Madhouse Act was passed, which required private asylums to be licensed and inspected. Although, at the best of its governors, Bethlem was exempted from this for some reason. An exclusion from this was obviously a contributory factor to the poor conditions later discovered at the hospital. I don't know why it was exempt. Discovery of similar conditions elsewhere, most notably the York Asylum, had led to the development of a coherent reformist movement whose influence was beginning to be felt inside Parliament. With Bethlem's legalisation threatened, their governors used their considerable influence to keep the hospital exempted from outside scrutiny, like I said before. This lasted for several years until 1814, when campaigner Edward Wakefield and a small group of MPs gained admission to Bethlem's wards. The visit had been rebuffed for weeks by Bethlem staff, and it soon became apparent why. So the MP staff have finally got into there. They can finally have a look around. Inside the Bethlem Asylum building, it was stark, dirty and cold, with no glazed windows or hot water. In those parts there were small cells populated by several people chained to walls or their beds. Many were stark naked with just a single blanket to protect them from the cold and rats. This included Anna Stone, whose treatment was called an act of disgusting idiocy. Patients' limbs were found to be crumpled with cold. The sight that most shocked the committee was that of James Norris. He was described as a clear and lucid man that had been tightly chained by his neck to an iron bar on the wall. With additional metal restraints on his chest, waist, feet and arms, Norris complained that his muscles were painful following a decade of confinement. The staff described Norris as violent and dangerous, but to the MPs he seemed quiet and perhaps even sane. The inspectors had seen enough and they called for a parliamentary inquiry into the conditions at Bethlem that they had just witnessed. During the inquiry, the medical staff fared poorly, with some blaming the others, all the workers there, while the doctor, Thomas Munro, argued that nothing the MPs had seen was wrong. He thought it was fine, the hospital. The drunken and insane surgeon, Crowther, could not be interviewed as he had died a few weeks previously. Bethlem's medical staff were dismissed, but the hospital's governors were not ones to have their authority challenged. In 1815, Bethlem was moved from its collapsing Moorfield site to a brand new building at St George's Field, south of the Thames. Lessons had been learned and the combination of a new building and new staff members brought about a reform of the sort that Wakefield and others had been calling for. An 1818 report found patients clean, amply supplied with wholesome provisions and well clothed, with nobody under restraint. A financial audit suggested that the hospital was solvent and generally well managed. Patient care and finances had improved, but individual problems still arose, such as the discovery in 1830 of apocryphy, I'm not sure how to say that, Edward Wright, in the female galleries drunk and with his clothing dishevelled. When asked about his duties, a colleague replied, smoking and opening and taking off the heads of the dead patients occasionally. He had developed a Frankenstein-like fascination with the dead and had created his own laboratory in the hospital's basement. Wow. However, because these instances did not directly concern the treatment of the patients, so Bethlem was again exempted from legalisation until 1853. After more than 6 centuries, the hospital was no longer independent, and in 1930 it was relocated to Beckenham in Kent, near me, where it continues as a psychiatric hospital today, now within the London Borough of Bromley. That's the end of... I just wanted to talk about Bethlem because it is a very, very notorious Victorian. Is it Victorian? Now we're going to go back to the progression of mental institutions as a whole. In the 1800s, attitudes towards the mental ill began to change. It was viewed as a disorder that required compassionate treatment that would help the person to get better. So we're having a good turnaround here instead of, you know, restraining them and being nasty. And this was actually because King George III had suffered really badly with his mental health. He had lots of breakdowns, and this ultimately led to a change in attitude that mental illness was seen as something which could be treated and cured. In 1808, the County Asylum Act was passed, which gave magistrates the power to build partially state-funded asylums in every county across England. 9 counties first applied, and the first public asylum to open was in Nottinghamshire in 1812. The introduction of the Act was an important landmark in history, as it changed the status of mentally ill people to patients who required treatment. The Act then created the Lunacy Commission, which would carry out the compulsory construction of asylums in every county with regular inspections. All asylums must have had a resident qualified physician, but although reforms were still taking place, the admission of people to asylums was still a bit of a concern at this time. Women could be sent there if men thought that they had strong opinions or if they were struggling to cope in a family. A doctor would be called to assess a potential patient after someone was labelled insane on social terms or had become socially or economically problematic. The fear was that people were becoming a source of embarrassment to their families, and this would cause them to be sent to asylums, which meant there was a surge in the population in these asylums. We're going to talk about Hanwell Asylum because this is a very important part of history. Hanwell Asylum was the first of the new wave of county asylums to open its doors in 1832. From the start, it took a very progressive approach to patient care. The first superintendent, Dr. William Charles Ellis, with his wife Mildred as matron, ran the asylum like a grand household. Dr. Ellis was known for his great principle of therapeutic treatment. Along with religion, he believed that work was essential to patients' recovery and rehabilitation. Within 4 years of his arrival at Hanwell, 320 of the 560 patients were regularly employed. Hanwell's extensive grounds were used for farming as well as recreation. A bakery, brewery and many other cottage industries aimed to make the asylum as self-sufficient as possible. You would find patients kneading their dough and in the washhouse doing laundry and many more things. Patients were not only earning their keep, but they were gaining the therapeutic benefits of work. The removal of physical restraints was at the heart of the system established by John Connolly, who was the third superintendent at Hanwell. He took his inspiration from the non-restraint system he observed at Lincoln Asylum. The traditional asylum keeper had a lowly status, often like a janitor. With non-restraint and moral treatment, more attention was obviously required from these attendants and nurses. The system required attendants to provide constant surveillance so they could intervene before harmful or destructive behaviour escalated. This meant not only more staff, but more staff needed to be trained to be able to provide safety for themselves if they were going to be attacked. The greatest challenge for non-restraint was how to manage these uncooperative and violent patients. For the most unruly patients, the last resort was isolation so they could not harm themselves or others. The Metropolitan Commissioners who inspected Hanwell supported Connolly's use of seclusion in the form of padded cells, finding it a very powerful effect in tranquilising and subduing those who were in temporary excitement or violent insanity. By 1845, physical restraints were on their way out of the public asylums. The new regime relied on strict operational systems and monitoring of both staff and patients to maintain order. To some extent, these Victorian asylums were a victim of their own success. With an ever-growing asylum population, it became difficult to maintain the sort of personalised moral treatment wanted by these early reformers. Medical superintendents and reformers started the century with the best of intentions, believing that a scientific approach to improve surroundings and a humane approach to care could lead to rehabilitation and recovery. And the new public asylums did make life much easier for most patients. Working in the asylum community gave them purpose and kept them reasonably well fed. In return for their good behaviour and hard work, they were rewarded with social activities such as plays, concerts and parties. But with growing asylum populations, it was found that the only way to maintain control in the overcrowded and poorly staffed asylums was to resort back to restraints, padded cells and sedatives. By the end of the century, the optimism around county asylums had virtually disappeared. An inspector who visited Hanwell in 1893 described gloomy corridors and walls, an absence of decoration, brightness and general smartness, and a want of sufficient ventilation. Conditions that were in a stark contrast to the moral treatment days of Ellis and Connolly. His conclusion was that it would be astonishing to find that any cures are ever made there. Yeah, I also wanted to show you some interesting 19th century photos. Obviously 19th century, I think that's like 1800s to, I don't really know. Interesting 19th century photos. This 1860s photograph shows a ward for non-violent women at the West Riding Asylum in Wakefield, England. Most of these patients had terminal dementia. The bonnet these women were wearing was common for female psychiatric patients at this time. This 1856 photograph is one of the earliest to decrypt a phrenologist at work. They believed the shape of the brain was an indicator of mental capacity and that different portions of the brain control different parts of the body. Simply by feeling bumps on the skull, a phrenologist would conclude information about a person's character, intelligence, and whether or not they lacked a certain personality trait. This 1885 photograph shows Dr. John Shaw Billings photographing a skull that's submerged in a tank of water to measure its cranial capacity, which was thought to influence mental conditions. Billings and his assistant had to act fast. If the skull was submerged for more than 45 seconds, it would absorb too much water and expand, providing an inaccurate measurement. This is an 1840s Utica crib, and this is made out of intricately carved wood. Many were also made of iron, and patients would sleep in it for extended periods of time. This was used on the most uncooperative and violent patients, and this is just awful. Now I'm going to put a quick trigger warning, skip like a minute along because I'm going to be showing a picture of a patient with an eating disorder, so please skip ahead, maybe skip ahead 2 minutes just in case. So even in the 19th century, psychiatrists saw patients with eating disorders. These images, published in Paris in 1892, show a young woman with visceral hysteric anorexia who gradually gave up eating until she developed cachexia, I'm not sure how to say that, a condition where the body is so malnourished it can't be reversed. Back then, anorexia was thought to just be a teenage girl disease. I just found this quite interesting. Now on to the 20th century. So by the beginning of the 20th century, moral treatment philosophy was essentially dead, to be replaced by more invasive therapies. After years of mental institutions becoming pretty much a little bit better for patients, they began to be terrible again. Due to overcrowding, not enough medical staff, and people being put in these facilities when they didn't really need to be there. So literally like anyone could go there at this point. In the 1920s and 1930s, psychologists began to take more experimental and interventionist approach to treating mental illness. Several new heroic physical therapies were introduced based on the belief that mental illness had a physical basis in the nervous system or brain. Among these therapies were insulin coma therapy, chemical shock therapy, psychosurgery, and electroconvulsive shock therapy. So we are going to talk about each one. Insulin coma therapy, also known as insulin shock therapy, was introduced in 1927 in Vienna by a Polish neurologist called Manfred Sakel. Sakel was using low doses of insulin to treat drug addicts and psychopaths. When one of his patients slipped into an accidental coma and woke with improved mental clarity, Sakel proposed that the treatment might work for other mental illnesses. Over a period of weeks or months, patients were given increasing amounts of insulin to slowly build their tolerance. Sakel advocated for 50 to 60 doses of insulin over several months until the dose was high enough for them to lapse into a coma. They remained in this coma state until the doctor revived them with a glucose solution. Insulin therapy was a labour-intensive treatment that required trained staff and a special unit. Patients with schizophrenia who were a target group for the therapy had to have the physical strength to withstand the treatment. It was a dangerous and distressing procedure, and patients risked complications such as heart failure or brain hemorrhage and possible death. When they were woken up from the coma, patients required continuous supervision because the danger of hypoglycemic aftershocks, which is the consequence of very low sugar levels in the blood. There was also a risk of brain damage if the patient stayed in the coma too long. Also, patients would have large amount of weight gain. Eventually, questions were raised about whether insulin shock therapy gave any real or lasting improvements in these conditions, but nonetheless, it continued to be widely used to treat schizophrenia even throughout the 1940s and 50s. Now, chemical shock therapy. Laszlo Meduna, a Hungarian neurologist, noted that the same people never had both epilepsy and schizophrenia. Don't know how he got together that idea. He speculated that this might be because epileptic seizures prevented schizophrenia. In the 1930s, he tested his theory by inducing chemical convulsions in some patients with schizophrenia to see if their condition improved. After some experimentation, he settled on the synthetic drug called cardiazole, known as metrazole in the US, as the convulsive trigger. Despite the limited scope of his tests and inconclusive results, Meduna publicised shock therapy as an effective treatment for schizophrenia. In 1937, the first international meeting on convulsive therapy was held in Switzerland, and within 3 years, it was being used worldwide. In the absence of any other effective treatment for schizophrenia, psychiatrists and neurologists turned to shock therapy as something to finally offer hope to their patients. But patients obviously grew to fear and loathe the therapy. Side effects included amnesia and violent and uncontrollable convulsions that sometimes resulted in shattered teeth, fractures and dislocations. In addition, the drug only seemed to give short-term relief for symptoms rather than a cure. Now, psychosurgery. The most invasive of the physical therapies was psychosurgery, also called leucotomy or prefrontal lobotomy. This was a surgical procedure in which the neural connections to and fro, the prefrontal cortex of the frontal lobes of the brains was severed. John Fulton, a professor at Yale University, picked up on the observations made during the First World War that soldiers with brain damage to the frontal lobes, which are the dominant control centres of the brains, were often left in euphoric, giddy or childlike states. He experimented with a procedure called a lobectomy on chimpanzees to observe the effect on the animal's behaviour. In 1935, Egas Moniz, a Portuguese neurologist, performed the first on a human. His theory was that insanity was the result of fixed ideas that were supported by established neural pathways in the prefrontal lobes. By disrupting the neural pathways, he believed that he could relieve many of the symptoms of mental illnesses. He claimed that the procedure was effective for anxiety, depression and agitated states. At first, Moniz and his colleague injected alcohol into the frontal lobes, but they modified this technique by using a tool to sever the neural links in the frontal lobes. The lesions were created with a tool called a leucotome, which had a retractable wire loop at one end and was inserted in the frontal lobes and rotated to tear the white matter of the frontal lobe. And this procedure would be repeated several times if necessary. This procedure was controversial from the outset and it offered low expectations of improvement, let alone even a cure. Electroconvulsive shock therapy. In 1938, two Italian scientists, Ugo Cerletti and Lucio Bini, developed an apparatus to induce convulsions electrically. They tried the method on a patient with chronic schizophrenia, giving him several shocks of increasing voltage and duration. During the last shock, he convulsed for more than a minute. The man received the treatment several times. Afterwards, he was quite lucid and deemed to be cured. But 2 years later, he was recommitted to the Milan asylum with schizophrenia. ECT was given as a remedy for schizophrenia and depression and was widely taken up by doctors across Europe. Several variations on the original apparatus were designed and patented to deliver stronger doses of current. The Second World War surged the take-up of this treatment after supplies of insulin needed for the insulin chemotherapy were in short supply. In addition, psychiatrists found it cheaper and easier to administer rather than insulin therapy. Views on ECT were generally positive in the early days of its use. In the UK, Robert Russell set up a company, Ektron Ltd, to manufacture ECT machines. At one time, nearly every hospital in the UK was equipped with these machines. In the early days, patients suffered fractures from the violent convulsions, and by the 1940s, routine use of Curare, a muscle relaxant, limited this problem. One long-term side effect was amnesia, which left gaps in the memory and that could affect a person's identity. Some psychiatrists suggested that this might be a positive outcome for patients who were focused on past events. The controversial British psychiatrist William Sargent saw another advantage of memory loss because patients could, quote, forget the increasing dread of further treatments. So then he could continue doing this electroconvulsive shock therapy on them. Just sick, really, isn't it? One treatment I read used in this time I thought quite sweet. So dancing was one that gave patients in the asylum something to look forward to, a way to express themselves physically and in an otherwise restrained environment. By the end of the 1920s, social contact, like dancing, was critical to psychiatric care. I think this was more of an American thing. But to avoid outbursts among more seriously ill patients, only same-sex partners were allowed to dance with each other. This is another interesting one. In 1927, Viennese psychiatrist Dr. Julius von Wagner-Jurek won a Nobel Prize for discovering fever therapy when he cured a patient with late-stage syphilis 10 years earlier by injecting him with malaria-tainted blood to induce a fever. It was considered the first true cure that halted a psychotic disease. Soon, all sorts of doctors were infecting their patients with malaria to cause a fever, until they realised many patients were actually dying from it. So they turned to other ways to heat up their patients, until the first report was published recommending ultrasound waves to therapeutically heat a person. That led to the production of machines like this full-body lever machine. According to a press release at the time, the machine heats the bloodstream and body tissue, much as does nature, killing off the germ. I don't really see there's any reason to do this. It makes no sense to me whatsoever. Now we've discussed these treatments, now we're going to talk about the early to mid 20th century institutions as a whole. Today, the majority of patients in mental health institutions are there at their own request. Sadly, during the first half of the 20th century, that was not the same thing that was going on. The laws of the era allowed people to be involuntarily committed by their loved ones with little to no evidence of any medical care needed. Even worse, mental health issues weren't actually necessary to seek an involuntary commitment. The history books are full of women who were committed to asylums for defying their husbands, practicing a different religion, or any other marital issues. I mean, we know women didn't have rights anyway, but this is just terrifying. Oh my god. Patients could also find no privacy at this time in these asylums. Patients were routinely stripped and checked for diseases with no consideration given to their privacy. Patients were still viewed at this time as prisoners more than sick people that needed help. Patients were also kept in small sleeping rooms at night, and they often slept up to 10 people. Meal times were also taken communally in large dining areas. Bathing was often seen as a form of treatment and would be conducted by staff in an open area with multiple patients being bathed at once. Patients could also find no privacy in who was told about their condition and progress. Women's husbands would be told of their condition and treatment regardless of their relationship with their spouse. An asylum patient could not expect any secrecy on their status, the fact that they were an inmate, what they'd been diagnosed with, and so on. Everyone knew everything. The Worcester County Asylum began screening children in its community for mental health issues in 1854. By the 1900s, the asylum had involuntarily committed over 200 children that the staff believed were mentally ill. Violent tendencies and risk of suicide were the most common reasons given for involuntarily committed children to this facility. Even misbehaviour, like masturbation, could result in a child being committed by their family. Once they were committed, the children rarely saw their families again, and it's not clear whether this was due to visitors not being allowed or if the stigma of, you know, being mentally ill caused these families to abandon their children once they'd been committed. One study found that children committed to the asylum had a noticeably higher death rate than the adults that were there. Children were treated in the same barbaric manner as adults at the time, which included being branded with hot irons and wrapped in wet cold blankets. It didn't matter they were younger. We're going to talk now about dehospitalisation. Psychiatric hospitals underwent transformations during the 1950s and 1960s, especially due to the introduction of the first neuroleptic drugs, such as chlorpromazine. The use of these new medical substances lowered patients' level of agitation and reduced their length of stay within these institutions. The 1960s also saw the diversification of therapeutical practices, also the arrival of new professions in European psychiatric institutions like psychologists, ergotherapists and social workers. The invasive, horrible physical treatments we saw before were mainly gone by the 1970s. Some acts that came about at this time. So since 1959 we have the 1959 Mental Health Act. Since 1959 the government has been defining mental health disorders in accordance with scientific research and subsequently giving rights and support to those who suffer with mental health difficulties. The Act repealed the Lunacy and Mental Treatment Acts 1890 to 1930 and the Mental Defiancy Acts of 1913 to 1938. One of the changes of the Act was getting rid of the category of the moral imbecile. In 1983 we saw another Mental Health Act. This act was introduced after that 1959 Mental Health Act was eventually repealed. The 1983 Mental Health Act currently applies in the UK, although it has been amended significantly since its introduction. This is a law in under which a person could be admitted, detained and treated in a hospital against their wishes. It applies to people who are assessed as having a mental disorder. Talking a bit now about modern day, within the next decade of 1950 and 1960, a new system of mental health care, the community mental health system, slowly began to take the place of the old poorly run and overcrowded asylums. This model of care continued, and most mental health care is now provided by psychiatrists and therapists in outpatient clinics throughout the UK. What's it like to be in a modern day psychiatric hospital? So obviously each person's experience will be different. For some individuals who voluntarily admit themselves, staying in the hospital may feel like a break from the extreme stresses of day-to-day life. For others, particularly people who've been brought in during an acute episode such as psychosis or mania, manic depression, the situation can feel quite terrifying, but the staff will try their best to help alleviate the person's fears and make them feel at ease. Many people experiencing episodes are taken to their local hospital's emergency department, where they will be evaluated by a mental health professional. They may either be placed in a safe room where they're monitored by a staff member until they're given a placement, either in that hospital if it has a psychiatric ward, or in another facility. At first glance, a psychiatric hospital may seem relatively sterile in appearance, since decorations like plants or wall art are considered a safety risk. On a more positive note, they are kept impeccably clean, but they can't have many things in there because it is a risk. Patients may be given their own room, or they would share with one other person. Doors are often locked and patients are monitored frequently. Clothing is comfortable, and this may involve scrubs or a casual shirt and pants. Belts, shoestrings, hoodie strings and similar items are not allowed. Many psychiatric hospitals have a set schedule. That routine may involve regularly scheduled meals, recreational indoor and outdoor activities, visiting hours and group therapy, and a set bedtime. Depending on the patient's length of stay, they will meet with a psychiatrist at regular intervals to discuss their treatment plan, as well as several multidisciplinary team members throughout their stay. That may include mental health counsellors, social workers, nurses, nurse practitioners, certified nurse assistants and chaplains. How long is the typical stay? All psychiatric hospitals emphasise short-term stays, because remember, people would stay in those asylums and not be rehabilitated back in the 18th and, well, back in the past, in the 1900s and stuff. In one 2019 research review, the average length of a hospital stay for a person with major depressive disorder was 6 days, though some people with more severe symptoms may stay for longer periods. For example, in this review, rehospitalisation often occurred within 30 days of original discharge, so we do see them keep getting put back in. So there's good and bad to this. Patients who voluntarily check themselves in may petition to leave within a day or two, even if they've been told not to, and that's medical advice. If the patient came in involuntary, they will undergo an evaluation process to determine whether they're able to care for themselves outside of 24-hour care. Every facility has different policies and procedures, but discharge typically depends on a few factors like medication compliance, sleeping, eating, showering, lack of condition-specific symptoms. These factors weigh in on how soon a patient is discharged. Doctors and staff want to make sure each person is safe and not a danger to themselves or others before they leave. In the United Kingdom, longer-term care facilities are now being replaced with smaller, secure units, some within hospitals. Modern buildings, modern security and being locally situated to help with the reintegration into society once their medication has been stabilised often feature such units. Examples of these include the Three Bridges unit at St Bernard's Hospital in West London, and the John Monroe Hospital in Staffordshire. These units have the goal of treatment and rehabilitation to allow for transition back into society within a short time frame. Not all patients' treatment meets this criteria. However, leading larger hospitals tend to take that role on. These hospitals provide rehabilitation and stabilisation for those who are actively experiencing uncontrolled symptoms of mental disorders such as depression, bipolar disorder, eating disorders and so on. In the UK, obviously high secure hospitals do exist. Ashworth Hospital in Merseyside, Broadmoor Hospital in Crowthorne, Rampton Secure Hospital in Retford, and the State Hospital in Scotland. Patients that go to these high secure hospitals usually are admitted from prison, the courts, or other secure psychiatric units. Occasionally patients may be admitted directly from the community or police custody. Many of these patients have not committed an offence yet, but they are considered to pose such a degree of risk that they need treatment in a high secure environment. So not all of them are absolute insane criminals that have killed someone. Some of them genuinely are, they're put in there before, something like that does happen, which is really good. Now, my conclusion is, I know we moan about mental health treatment, but come on, we moan about everything. The way it's progressed is incredible, and how mental health was viewed before made the asylums more horrible. They just wanted to put them away for various reasons, not really wanting to care for them, or just because they were too big and there was no staff. Now, due to research, etc., the psychiatric facilities and hospitals aim to actually help and care for the patients in calmer ways, like therapy and studied medications that are proven to help them. So that is the end of my video. I really hope you enjoyed it. If you did, give it a big thumbs up. I hope you are enjoying these new type of videos on my channel. It makes me very happy. Sorry if I missed anything out in this. I don't want to make this video too long, but yeah. Subscribe, it would mean the world. Comment down below your thoughts and opinions, and I'll see you all soon.